Sometimes a single moment can change everything you thought you knew about your life. We've all made choices that seemed simple at the time, only to discover they carried consequences we never saw coming. In the dusty boomtown of Larkspur, wealthy rancher Holt McCready made such a choice. On a drunken dare, he pointed to a woman in emerald green at the Gilded Lily Saloon and declared her his bride. That woman was Josephine DeWitt, believed dead by her father, the territorial governor who once controlled these lands. What started as an impulsive wedding uncovered secrets of kidnapping and political conspiracy. Hidden enemies emerged from the shadows. Holt and Josephine discovered they were pawns in a deadly game. But could two unlikely souls change their fate before the past destroyed them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the silver-rich mountains of Colorado Territory, where Holt McCready had built his fortune one careful decision at a time. His weathered hands turned the pages of his mining ledger, each entry recorded in precise script that spoke of a man who valued order above all else. The leather-bound book represented more than business records. It was proof of how methodical planning could transform a poor farm boy into one of the territory's wealthiest ranchers. At 42, Holt possessed the kind of steady prosperity that should have brought contentment. His Silver Creek Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime mountain land, while his mining operation pulled precious metal from the earth with reliable consistency. The ledger showed numbers that would make most men envious. Enough wealth to last several lifetimes, investments in cattle and land that grew more valuable each year, and a reputation for honest dealing that opened doors throughout the territory. Yet something was missing from those neat columns of figures. No entry existed for companionship, no line item for love or laughter echoing through his empty ranch house. Holt lived alone except for his ranch hands, finding solace in the quiet rhythms of mountain life, but growing weary of conversations limited to cattle prices and weather patterns. The ranch house itself reflected his practical nature: solid timber construction, functional furniture, and few decorations beyond what served a purpose. His bedroom contained a simple bed, a chest for clothes, and a window that looked out over the mountain peaks. The kitchen held everything needed for basic meals, but lacked the warmth that comes from shared cooking and conversation. It was a house built for one man's needs, efficient and comfortable, but echoing with an emptiness that no amount of silver could fill. 20 miles down the mountain, the boomtown of Larkspur painted a different picture entirely. Where Holt's ranch embodied order and quiet prosperity, the town pulsed with the chaotic energy of men chasing quick fortunes. Wooden buildings lined dusty streets where miners, cowboys, and merchants mingled in an endless dance of commerce and vice. The smell of sawdust, whiskey, and unwashed bodies created an atmosphere that spoke of rough living and rougher justice. The Gilded Lily Saloon stood at the heart of this frontier chaos, its swinging doors admitting a steady stream of men seeking liquid comfort after long days of back-breaking labor. Inside, oil lamps cast flickering light on painted walls, while a piano player provided music that competed with the constant buzz of conversation and the clink of glasses. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and dreams of striking it rich. Behind the bar, serving drinks with practiced efficiency, worked a woman who seemed oddly out of place in such rough surroundings. Josephine DeWitt moved with a grace that spoke of refined upbringing, her emerald green dress cutting a striking figure against the saloon's crude backdrop. At 28, she possessed an intelligence that shone through careful brown eyes, though she took great pains to keep that intelligence hidden beneath the role she played. Few patrons of the Gilded Lily knew that the woman they called Josie had once lived in the territorial capital's finest mansion. Fewer still would have believed that Governor Theodore DeWitt had spent 5 years mourning the daughter he believed murdered by kidnappers. The official story, repeated in newspaper accounts and political circles, told of young Miss Josephine DeWitt's disappearance during a carriage ride, followed by demands for ransom that led nowhere, and a father's heartbreak that shaped territorial politics for years afterward. The truth was far more complex. Josephine had indeed been taken, but her escape had come through courage and allies she'd never expected to find. The decision to remain hidden, to let her father believe her dead, rather than reveal the corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, had been the hardest choice of her life. Yet each day she remained concealed was another day she stayed alive, another day she gathered information about those who'd wanted her silenced. Working at the Gilded Lily provided perfect cover. Who would look for a governor's daughter among the saloon girls of a rough mining town? The role required her to be friendly but not too familiar, attractive but not available, present but not memorable. She'd perfected the art of blending into the background while keeping her ears open for useful information. Her small room above the saloon contained few possessions, but each one was carefully chosen. A worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, hidden beneath loose floorboards, a silver locket containing her mother's photograph tucked inside her bodice, and a small Derringer pistol sewn into her dress hem. These items represented the three aspects of her hidden identity: the educated woman, the grieving daughter, and the survivor who'd learned that sometimes a lady must be prepared to defend herself. The political landscape that had shaped both their lives was as rough and unforgiving as the mountain terrain. Colorado Territory in 1882 was a place where vast fortunes could be made or lost on the turn of a card, where territorial positions meant the difference between prosperity and poverty for entire communities. Governor DeWitt had built his career on promises of bringing order to the frontier, but his effectiveness had been compromised by the personal tragedy that haunted his every decision. In the territorial capital, men in expensive suits made deals that affected thousands of lives, while in places like Larkspur, the results of those decisions played out in daily struggles for survival and prosperity. Silver mining rights, cattle grazing permits, and railroad routes were all subject to political influence, creating opportunities for corruption that reached from the governor's mansion to the humblest mining claim. Holt had managed to stay above these political machinations through a combination of careful dealing and geographic isolation. His ranch was remote enough to avoid most territorial disputes, while his reputation for fairness and his considerable wealth provided protection against all but the most determined enemies. He preferred to solve problems with straightforward conversation and fair compensation rather than political maneuvering or legal battles. This preference for simple solutions would soon lead him into the most complicated situation of his life. For weeks, he'd been feeling the weight of his solitary existence more keenly than usual. The ledger's neat columns seemed to mock him with their precision, highlighting what couldn't be quantified or purchased: companionship, conversation, and the simple pleasure of sharing his success with someone who understood its value. The ranch hands had noticed their boss's growing restlessness. Tom Bradley, his foreman for 8 years, had watched Holt stare off at the mountains with an expression that spoke of longing for something beyond the horizon. Man needs more than cattle and silver to make a complete life, Tom had observed to the other hands, though he was careful never to voice such opinions directly to his employer. As autumn painted the mountain aspens in brilliant gold, Holt found himself making increasingly frequent trips to Larkspur. Ostensibly, these visits were for supplies and business, but he lingered longer than necessary, observing the rough vitality of the town with growing fascination. The chaos that had once seemed distasteful now appeared energetic and alive in ways his ordered ranch life was not. On a particularly clear October evening, as the first snow dusted the high peaks, Holt made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning directly to the ranch after concluding his business at the assay office, he turned his horse toward the Gilded Lily Saloon. The sound of music and laughter spilling into the street seemed to promise something his empty ranch house could not provide. He had no way of knowing that inside the saloon, a woman in emerald green was serving drinks while listening carefully to conversations that might someday help her understand why powerful men had wanted her dead. Josephine had learned patience during her years in hiding, but she too felt the weight of isolation, the burden of living a life that wasn't truly her own. Neither could have predicted that a simple evening's entertainment would set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of territorial politics. As Holt pushed through the saloon's swinging doors, stepping from the quiet mountain night into the warm chaos within, fate began to weave a pattern that would test everything both of them thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the price of truth. The stage was set for an encounter that would prove some choices, however impulsive they might seem, carry the power to reshape not just individual lives, but the very landscape of power itself. The gilded Lily Saloon buzzed with its usual Friday night energy as Holt Macready pushed through the batwing doors, the familiar sense of whiskey and tobacco smoke washing over him. Piano music competed with the rumble of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter from the card tables. He'd visited the saloon perhaps a dozen times over the past few months, always sitting alone at the bar, nursing a single whiskey while observing the rough camaraderie he'd never quite learned to join. Tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the lamplight seemed warmer, or perhaps the fact that 3 other successful ranchers had already hailed him from a corner table. Jake Morrison, who ran cattle on the east slope, raised his glass in greeting. "Holt, come join us before we drink all the good stuff." For once, instead of politely declining, Holt found himself walking over to their table. The men welcomed him with the easy fellowship of successful peers, and soon he was drawn into discussions of cattle prices, winter preparations, and the territorial legislature's latest schemes. The whiskey flowed more freely than usual, and Holt discovered that conversation came easier when shared among men who understood the challenges of building something lasting in unforgiving country. "You know what your problem is, Macready," declared Bill Harrison, a bear of a man who owned the largest spread in the valley. His words were slightly slurred, but his eyes held the calculating gleam of someone who'd made his fortune by reading people correctly. "You're too damned careful, always thinking everything through, weighing every decision like it was made of silver." The other men laughed, but not unkindly. They respected Holt's success, even if they didn't always understand his methods. Tom Brennan, youngest of the group at 35, leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone who'd had just enough to drink to feel philosophical. "Bill's right, you know. Sometimes a man's got to take a chance, make a move without thinking it to death." "Easy words from men with wives waiting at home," Holt replied, though without bitterness. "Some of us haven't been blessed with such companionship." "Blessed? Hell," Jake snorted. "More like brave enough to take a chance. You think any of us knew for certain our wives were the right choice? Sometimes you just got to trust your gut and see what happens." The conversation might have ended there, just another evening's philosophical discussion fueled by good whiskey and male bonding. But Bill Harrison, emboldened by alcohol and the kind of mischief that successful men sometimes use to test each other, decided to push the matter further. "I'll tell you what, Holt," he said, his voice carrying across the table with the weight of a challenge. "You're always so careful, always planning every move. How about we see if you've got any spontaneity left in that calculating brain of yours?" "What did you have in mind?" Holt asked, though something in Bill's tone suggested he might regret the question. Bill grinned and pulled a silver dollar from his vest pocket. "Simple proposition. I flip this coin, and if it comes up heads, you walk up to that bar and propose to the first woman who catches your eye. No thinking, no planning, just pure gut instinct." The table fell silent for a moment as the implications sank in. Tom Brennan whistled low. "That's a hell of a dare, Bill." "And if it comes up tails?" Holt asked, surprised to find himself considering the proposition. "Then you buy the next round and we never speak of it again," Bill replied. "But if it's heads, you pick a woman and ask her to marry you, right here, right now." Jake leaned back in his chair, studying Holt's face. "You don't have to do this, you know. Bill's just had too much whiskey and too little sense." But something in Holt stirred at the challenge. Maybe it was the whiskey, or perhaps the accumulated weight of too many careful decisions and solitary evenings. For once in his methodical life, the idea of acting purely on instinct held a strange appeal. "And if she says yes, then you follow through like a man," Bill said simply. "No backing out, no second-guessing. One flip, one choice, one chance to see what happens when Holt McCready stops calculating the odds." The coin lay in Bill's palm, catching the lamplight. Around them, the saloon's noise seemed to fade as the moment stretched taut with possibility. Holt looked around the room, taking in the various women who worked the floor, serving drinks and providing companionship to the miners and cowboys. Most were friendly enough, but worn down by frontier life and the demands of their profession. Then his eyes fell on the woman in emerald green. She moved behind the bar with an efficiency that spoke of competence, but there was something in her bearing that set her apart from the others. Where most of the saloon girls carried themselves with either hard-edged toughness or weary resignation, this one possessed a dignity that seemed almost out of place. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly, and when she turned to serve a customer, Holt caught a glimpse of intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. "Reckon I know which one caught your attention," Tom observed quietly. "That's Josie. Been working here about 2 years, keeps to herself mostly. Good woman from what I hear, but not the type to be trifled with." Bill hefted the coin, his eyes gleaming with alcohol and mischief. "So, what's it to be, Holt? Ready to let fate make a decision for once?" Holt found himself nodding before his rational mind could intervene. "Flip it." The coin spun through the smoky air, catching flashes of lamplight as it rose and fell. Time seemed suspended as it landed in Bill's palm, his hand quickly covering it before anyone could see the result. The 4 men leaned forward, and even some nearby patrons had noticed something was happening. Bill lifted his hand with theatrical flair. Heads. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Jake let out a low chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. Fate's made your choice for you." Holt stared at the coin, feeling something shift inside him. All his careful planning, all his methodical decision-making, and here he was about to take the most important gamble of his life based on the flip of a silver dollar. The irony wasn't lost on him. He stood up slowly, his legs steadier than he'd expected despite the evening's whiskey. The woman in emerald green, Josie, was polishing glasses behind the bar, unaware that she was about to become the center of a moment that would change everything. As he walked across the saloon floor, Holt was dimly aware that conversations were quieting, that people were beginning to watch. Word traveled fast in small places, and the sight of one of the territory's most eligible bachelors approaching the bar with obvious purpose was bound to draw attention. Josie looked up as he approached, her brown eyes meeting his with polite, professional interest. "Evening, Mr. McCready. What can I get for you?" She knew his name, he realized, though he couldn't recall introducing himself on his previous visits. Up close, she was even more striking, not in the painted, artificial way of most saloon workers, but with a natural beauty that cosmetics couldn't improve. There was intelligence in her face, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Wariness, perhaps, or the kind of careful reserve that came from hard experience. "Actually, miss," he began, then realized he didn't know her last name. "DeWitt," she supplied quietly, and something flickered across her face so quickly he almost missed it. Josie DeWitt. Behind him he could hear Bill Harrison's voice carrying across the now quiet saloon. "Go on, Holt. A deal's a deal." The moment stretched between them, and Holt realized that whatever happened next would define not just his future, but hers as well. The simple gold wedding ring he'd impulsively purchased from the jeweler that very afternoon, a ring he'd told himself was just a precautionary measure, suddenly felt heavy in his vest pocket. "Miss DeWitt," he said, his voice carrying farther than he'd intended in the hushed saloon, "I wonder if you'd do me the honor of becoming my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Josephine DeWitt set down the glass she'd been polishing with hands that barely trembled. Every eye in the gilded lily was fixed on her, waiting for her response to what had to be the most unusual marriage proposal in Larkspur's brief but colourful history. Behind Holt, she could hear Bill Harrison's nervous laughter and the scrape of chairs as patrons leaned forward to catch her reply. "Mr. Macready," she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the nearest tables. "That's quite an unexpected question." Holt felt heat creeping up his neck as the reality of what he'd just done began to sink in. The whiskey's courage was fading, replaced by the mortifying awareness that he'd just proposed to a woman he barely knew in front of half the town. Yet something in her calm demeanour, the way she neither laughed nor fled, kept him rooted in place. "Yes, ma'am, I suppose it is," he replied. "But I find myself hoping you might consider it anyway." Josephine's mind raced through possibilities and consequences. 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity hung in the balance. In the space of a heartbeat, she had to weigh the risks of accepting against the dangers of remaining where she was. Recent weeks had brought subtle signs that her cover might be compromised. Too many curious glances, too many questions about her past from customers who seemed more interested in her answers than her drinks. This rough but clearly prosperous rancher might represent something she'd never expected to find, a legitimate escape from the precarious life she'd built. More than that, something in his steady grey eyes suggested the kind of honourable character that had become rare in her experience. "I accept," she said simply, and the saloon erupted in cheers and applause. What followed passed in a blur of noise and movement. Someone fetched the travelling preacher who'd been drinking at the corner table, while others volunteered as witnesses. Bill Harrison, delighted with the success of his dare, insisted on buying drinks for the house. The ceremony itself was brief and somewhat chaotic, conducted over the sounds of celebration and punctuated by good-natured advice shouted from the crowd. When Holt slipped the simple gold ring onto her finger, Josephine felt a complex mix of emotions. The weight of the band was nothing compared to the weight of deception she carried. This good man was marrying someone he believed to be a simple saloon worker named Josie DeWitt, unaware that his new bride was the supposedly dead daughter of the territorial governor. The hidden locket containing her father's photograph pressed against her chest like a guilty secret. Inside was the image of Governor Theodore DeWitt, taken during happier times when she'd been his cherished daughter rather than a ghost haunting the frontier. That locket, carefully concealed beneath her dress, represented everything she'd lost and everything she couldn't reveal, not yet, perhaps not ever. As the crowd began to thin and the initial excitement faded, reality set in for both of them. They were married, legally bound by territorial law and witnessed by dozens of people, but they were essentially strangers, embarking on the most intimate of partnerships based on a coin flip and mutual desperation for something neither could quite name. "I should gather my things," Josephine said finally, when they found themselves standing somewhat apart from the lingering celebrants. "Of course," Holt replied, though he seemed uncertain about the practical details of their new situation. "I have a wagon outside. The ranch is about 3 hours' ride up into the mountains." As Josephine climbed the narrow stairs to her small room above the saloon, she tried to process the magnitude of what she'd just done. Her few possessions fit easily into a single carpet bag: the carefully hidden book of Shakespeare's sonnets, a spare dress, undergarments, and personal necessities. She strapped the small derringer to her thigh beneath her skirts, a precaution that had become second nature during her years in hiding. The locket she wore remained around her neck, its chain hidden beneath the high collar of her travelling dress. Whatever else happened, she couldn't bear to be completely separated from the last tangible connection to her former life. Downstairs, Holt waited by the bar, soberly contemplating what he'd committed himself to. The other ranchers had departed with backslapping congratulations and promises to visit soon, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his new bride. He'd built his success through careful planning and methodical execution, yet here he was married to a woman whose last name he'd learned only minutes before proposing. The ride to Silver Creek Ranch passed mostly in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the wagon climbed through mountain passes silvered by moonlight. Occasionally Holt would point out a landmark or explain some feature of the terrain, while Josephine offered polite responses that revealed little about her thoughts or background. "The ranch house isn't fancy," Holt said, as they approached his property, suddenly conscious that his utilitarian approach to home decoration might seem stark to a woman. "I've always focused more on function than appearance." "I'm sure it's fine," Josephine replied, though she wondered what she'd gotten herself into. The darkness made it impossible to see much detail, but the sense of isolation was unmistakable. For someone who'd spent 3 years surrounded by the constant activity of a boomtown, the mountain silence felt profound and slightly unsettling. The house, when they reached it, proved to be larger than she'd expected, a solid 2-story structure built from local timber with a wide front porch and several outbuildings visible in the moonlight. It spoke of prosperity and permanence, qualities that had been missing from her life for far too long. Inside, Holt lit oil lamps to reveal rooms that were indeed functional, rather than decorative, but clean and comfortable. The furniture was well made but sparse, chosen for durability rather than style. It was clearly a bachelor's establishment, efficient but lacking the feminine touches that made a house feel like a home. "I can take the spare room," Holt said awkwardly as they stood in the main hallway. That is. I don't want you to feel—" "Thank you," Josephine said quietly, grateful for his consideration. That would be appropriate, at least for now. As she settled into the guest bedroom, surrounded by the unfamiliar sounds of a mountain night, Josephine allowed herself to hope that perhaps her gamble had paid off. Holt McCready seemed to be exactly what he appeared, a successful, honorable man who'd acted impulsively but without malice. If she could maintain her carefully constructed identity, this marriage might provide the security and legitimacy she'd never dared hope for. Outside, mountain winds whispered through the pines, carrying scents of snow and pine resin that would soon become as familiar as the sounds of Larkspur's busy streets had been. Neither bride nor groom slept much that first night, both wondering what they'd committed themselves to and whether morning light would bring regret or possibility. The first week of marriage passed with the careful politeness of strangers learning to share the same space. Holt maintained his usual ranch routines, rising before dawn to check on cattle and oversee mining operations, while Josephine explored her new environment with the cautious curiosity of someone still uncertain about her welcome. She surprised everyone, including herself, by adapting quickly to ranch life. The domestic skills she'd learned during her privileged upbringing, combined with the practical knowledge gained during 3 years of self-reliance, served her well in managing the household. Within days, the ranch house began to show feminine touches, curtains in the windows, fresh flowers on the kitchen table, and meals that went beyond Holt's previous diet of beef, beans, and whatever his housekeeper had left in the pantry. "She's got away with horses, that's something to see," Tom Bradley confided to Holt as they watched Josephine work with a particularly spirited mare in the corral. "Most folks are afraid of that one, but your missus just walked right up and started talking to her like they were old friends." Holt had noticed the same thing. Despite her supposed background as a saloon worker, Josephine showed an easy familiarity with horses that spoke of extensive experience. She rode with the confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time in the saddle, and her knowledge of horse care and breeding was surprisingly sophisticated. "Where did you learn so much about horses?" he asked one evening as they sat on the front porch, sharing the comfortable ritual that was becoming their habit after supper. "My father," she replied without thinking, then caught herself. "That is, the man who raised me had a small stable. I helped care for the horses when I was younger." The answer was technically true. Governor DeWitt had maintained one of the finest stables in the territory, but it required careful omission of details that would have revealed too much. These small deceptions were becoming a constant weight, requiring her to edit every story and measure every response. Holt sensed there was more to her background than she was revealing, but he was a patient man accustomed to earning trust gradually. If his new wife had secrets, he reasoned, she would share them when she felt ready. In the meantime, he found himself genuinely enjoying her company and increasingly grateful for the impulse that had brought them together. The ranch hands accepted her with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Tom Bradley, the foreman, appreciated her practical approach to household management and her obvious positive effect on his employer's mood. The younger hands were charmed by her willingness to listen to their stories and patch their torn clothing. Only Jake Miller, the oldest and most suspicious member of the crew, watched her with the wariness of a man who'd learned to question anything that seemed too good to be true. "Don't make sense," he muttered to Tom one afternoon as they watched Josephine help birth a difficult calf with the skill of an experienced rancher. "Saloon girl who knows horses, can cook like somebody's grandmother, and handles herself around cattle like she was born to it. Something don't add up." Tom had noticed the same inconsistencies, but was inclined to be charitable. "Maybe she just learned from watching. Some people pick things up quick." "Maybe," Jake replied, but his expression remained doubtful. The suspicion might have remained just idle speculation, if not for the arrival of strangers asking questions. First came a traveling salesman who seemed more interested in discussing the ranch's new mistress than selling his wares. Then a pair of drifters appeared in Larkspur, buying drinks and asking casual questions about recent arrivals and notable events. Josephine became aware of the attention gradually, through small signs that might have been dismissed individually but formed a troubling pattern when considered together. The way conversations stopped when she entered the general store, the manner in which certain customers at the Gilded Lily had studied her face with more than casual interest during her final days there, the questions about her background that seemed to probe for information rather than express friendly curiosity. One evening, while sorting through old newspapers that Holt had brought from town, she found what she'd been dreading: a weathered wanted poster offering a reward for information about the whereabouts of Miss Josephine DeWitt, daughter of Governor Theodore DeWitt, presumed kidnapped and possibly murdered 3 years earlier. The poster, dated from the month after her disappearance, featured a formal portrait taken during her coming-out season. The young woman in the photograph looked different from the saloon worker. She'd become softer, more innocent, with elaborate hairstyles and expensive clothing, but the resemblance was unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. Her hands trembled as she stared at her father's formal signature at the bottom of the notice, offering a substantial reward for any information leading to the recovery of his beloved daughter or the apprehension of those responsible for her disappearance. The pain in those carefully chosen words was evident even in the stilted language of official documents. That night, sleep eluded her completely. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the moonlit mountains, weighing the impossible choices before her. Every day she remained silent was another day she allowed her father to grieve for a daughter who wasn't dead. Every day she stayed hidden was another day those responsible for her kidnapping remained free to harm others. Yet revealing herself would almost certainly mean death, not just for her, but potentially for anyone who'd helped her or whom she'd involved in her deception, including, she realized with growing dread, her new husband. Holt had noticed her growing tension, the way she started at unexpected sounds and studied every visitor with barely concealed anxiety. During their evening conversations, she seemed distracted, as though listening for something beyond their immediate surroundings. "Is everything all right?" he asked finally, when her distraction became too obvious to ignore. "Just adjusting to married life," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's quite a change from my previous circumstances." He wanted to press the issue, sensing there was much more she wasn't telling him, but something in her manner suggested that pushing would only cause her to withdraw further. Instead, he reached across the space between their chairs and briefly touched her hand, a gesture of support that said he was willing to wait for her trust, however long that might take. The warmth of his touch and the genuine care behind it almost broke her resolve to maintain her silence. For a moment she considered telling him everything, her real identity, the circumstances of her disappearance, the political forces that had driven her into hiding. But the risk was too great, not just to herself, but to this good man who'd unknowingly married into a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. She squeezed his hand briefly before pulling away, the weight of deception heavier than ever. 300 miles away in the territorial capital, Governor Theodore DeWitt pressed his official seal into warm red wax, completing another document in what had become an endless stream of legislation and territorial business. At 58, he carried the weight of leadership in the deep lines around his eyes and the silver that had overtaken his once dark hair. The official seal, a mountain eagle clutching arrows and an olive branch, had become as familiar as his own signature, marking documents that shaped the lives of thousands of territorial citizens. The governor's office reflected both the dignity of his position and the rough pragmatism required by frontier governance. Maps covered one wall, showing mining claims, railroad routes, and the constant territorial disputes that demanded his attention. His desk was laden with correspondence from Washington, petitions from constituents, and reports from territorial marshals about crimes and political unrest in far-flung communities. But it was the smaller items on his desk that revealed the man behind the office. A silver-framed photograph of his late wife, a leather-bound volume of poetry that had belonged to his daughter, and a stack of reports from private investigators who continued searching for information about Josephine's fate despite years of fruitless effort. "Sir, we have the railroad representatives waiting," his secretary announced from the doorway. "They're eager to discuss the new spur line through Silver Creek Canyon." DeWitt nodded absently, his attention focused on a telegram that had arrived that morning, another reported sighting of his daughter, this one from a mining town called Larkspur. They came regularly well-meaning citizens who thought they'd spotted a young woman matching Josephine's description, hopeful fortune hunters seeking the standing reward, and occasionally cruel hoaxers who seemed to take pleasure in a grieving father's pain. This telegram was different, though. It came from Marshal Henry Walsh, a reliable man whose judgment DeWitt had learned to trust. Recent marriage in Larkspur area raises questions. Woman calling herself DeWitt matches general description. Investigating discreetly. Will report findings. The governor's hands trembled slightly as he set the telegram aside. 3 years of false hopes had taught him to guard against optimism, yet something about this particular report felt different. The name DeWitt was uncommon in territorial records, and the timing seemed significant given recent political developments in that region. Those developments were themselves cause for concern. Silver Creek Canyon represented one of the richest mining areas in the territory, and control over its resources had become a matter of intense political interest. Several influential businessmen had approached him about facilitating land transfers that would consolidate mining rights under more efficient management, but something about their proposals troubled him. Richard Blackwood, leader of the Territorial Business Consortium, had been particularly persistent. A man with interests spanning mining, railroads, and banking, Blackwood possessed the kind of wealth that could fund political campaigns or destroy them. His latest visit had carried undertones that felt more like threats than requests for cooperation. "Governor, you must understand the strategic importance of consolidated development," Blackwood had argued during their most recent meeting. "Individual small-scale operations waste resources and impede progress. The territory's future depends on more sophisticated approaches to resource extraction." What Blackwood hadn't said, but DeWitt understood clearly, was that territorial regulations and individual property rights were obstacles to be overcome rather than protections to be maintained. The businessman's vision of progress seemed to leave little room for the independent operators who'd built their livelihoods through honest effort and personal risk. DeWitt had built his political career on the promise of bringing order to frontier chaos, but he'd learned to distinguish between beneficial order and the kind of control that served only concentrated power. His daughter's disappearance had taught him that corruption could reach into the highest circles, that even those sworn to protect citizens could become instruments of those seeking to exploit them. The investigation into Josephine's kidnapping had revealed disturbing connections between territorial criminals and supposedly legitimate businessmen. Several leads had pointed toward a conspiracy involving land speculation and political manipulation, but key witnesses had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances before providing definitive proof. Now, as he prepared to meet with railroad representatives who were closely allied with Blackwood's consortium, DeWitt wondered if the telegram from Larkspur might be connected to these larger patterns of corruption. The timing seemed too coincidental. Renewed pressure for land consolidation in Silver Creek Canyon, combined with reports of a woman named DeWitt in precisely the same area. "Send word to Marshal Walsh," he instructed his secretary. "Tell him to proceed with extreme caution, but to investigate thoroughly, and arrange for 2 additional marshals to be assigned to that district. I want reliable men watching the situation." "Yes, sir." "What reason should I give for the additional assignments?" "General territorial security," DeWitt replied. "There's been increased criminal activity in the mining regions." That wasn't entirely false. Reports of claim jumping, intimidation of small operators, and mysterious accidents affecting independent miners had been increasing throughout the territory. What concerned DeWitt was the pattern problems seemed to concentrate in areas where Blackwood's consortium expressed development, interest, and solutions inevitably involved property transfers to larger, more stable operations. As he reviewed the afternoon's agenda, the governor's thoughts kept returning to his daughter. The official story, carefully maintained for public consumption, was that Miss Josephine DeWitt had been kidnapped and presumably murdered by criminals seeking ransom. The truth was more complex and far more dangerous. Josephine had been targeted not randomly, but specifically because her father's investigation into territorial corruption had come too close to exposing powerful interests. Her kidnapping was meant to serve as both distraction and warning, forcing DeWitt to focus on personal tragedy rather than political reform, while demonstrating the price of challenging certain established arrangements. The kidnappers had underestimated both his daughter's resourcefulness and his own determination. While publicly grieving and seemingly distracted by personal loss, DeWitt had continued his investigation through private channels. He'd learned to trust no one completely, to verify information independently, and to proceed with the caution of a man who'd seen how far his enemies were willing to go. If the telegram from Larkspur proved accurate, if his daughter was truly alive and hiding in one of the territory's most contested regions, then the game was about to change dramatically. Those who'd tried to silence him through personal tragedy would discover that Theodore DeWitt was far from defeated. But first, he had to determine whether hope was justified or whether this was simply another cruel deception designed to manipulate a father's grief. Either way, the situation in Silver Creek Canyon was about to receive the governor's complete attention, along with whatever resources he could deploy without alerting those who might seek to harm his daughter again. The official seal caught lamplight as he prepared for the afternoon's meetings, its familiar weight now carrying new significance in what might prove to be the most important political battle of his career. Josephine's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter that had arrived with Holt's regular correspondence from the territorial capital. Her father's familiar handwriting sent waves of memory and longing through her as she read words meant for public consumption but containing the private anguish only she could fully understand. The letter, addressed to territorial officials regarding criminal activity in mining regions, mentioned his ongoing search for his daughter and his determination to see justice served for all territorial citizens. She'd found the correspondence by accident while helping Holt organize business papers, but seeing her father's signature, Theodore DeWitt, Governor, Colorado Territory, felt like receiving a message from another lifetime. The formal language couldn't disguise the pain beneath his carefully chosen words, the grief that had shaped territorial policy for 3 years as he struggled to function as a public servant while mourning as a private man. "My dearest Josie," she whispered in the privacy of their bedroom, imagining the words he might have written if he'd known she was alive. "My precious daughter, who gave meaning to everything I tried to accomplish in this rough country." The memories came flooding back afternoons in his study as he explained the complexities of territorial governance, evening walks around the mansion grounds while he shared his dreams of Colorado statehood, quiet moments when he'd spoken of her mother and the legacy they hoped to build together. Governor DeWitt had been more than a political figure. He'd been a devoted father whose world had crumbled when he'd believed his only child murdered. The kidnapping had happened during her 20th birthday celebration, when she'd been returning from a charitable event in the territorial capital. 3 men had stopped her carriage on a lonely stretch of road, claiming to be territorial marshals with urgent news requiring her immediate attention. By the time she'd realized their credentials were false, it had been too late to escape. The abandoned mining cabin where they'd held her had become her prison for 6 terrifying weeks. Her captors had spoken freely in her presence, apparently unconcerned about witnesses, since they'd planned to kill her once their larger scheme succeeded. Through their careless conversations, she'd learned that her kidnapping was part of a broader conspiracy to control territorial development by manipulating her father's decisions. "The old man's too honest for his own good," she remembered one captor saying, "but grief makes a man more flexible. Once he stops looking for his daughter and starts focusing on preventing future tragedies, he'll be more cooperative with reasonable business propositions." Her escape had come through a combination of desperate courage and unexpected assistance. Samuel Running Bear, a Ute tracker who'd been hired to hunt for her, had discovered the cabin during one of her captors' absences. Instead of reporting her location to territorial authorities, where the information might have reached those who'd arranged her disappearance, he'd helped her flee to safety. "Your father is good man. But even good men have enemies in positions of trust," Samuel had warned as he'd helped her reach a distant mining camp. "Those who took you have long arms and longer memories. Staying dead might keep you breathing." The wisdom of his advice had become clear during her weeks in hiding. News of her supposed death had indeed shifted her father's political focus, making him more willing to compromise on issues that had previously seemed non-negotiable. The territorial business interests that had orchestrated her kidnapping were gradually achieving their goals through his grief-driven acquiescence to policies he would have opposed when thinking clearly. Living under an assumed identity in Larkspur had allowed her to observe the effects of these policies firsthand. Independent miners spoke bitterly of increased fees, arbitrary regulations, and mysterious accidents that seemed to plague anyone who refused to sell claims to larger operations. The freedom and opportunity that had drawn settlers to Colorado Territory were being systematically eroded by men who viewed natural resources as private wealth rather than public trust. Now, 3 years later, her impulsive marriage to Holt McCready had complicated everything. Her husband was exactly the kind of independent operator being targeted by the consortium, successful enough to be worth acquiring, isolated enough to be vulnerable, and principled enough to resist unfair pressure. By accepting his proposal, she'd inadvertently placed him in the center of the conspiracy she'd been hiding from. The growing attraction between them made the deception even more painful. Holt treated her with the respect and affection she'd never expected to find, creating moments of genuine happiness that were shadowed by the constant awareness that their relationship was built on lies. When he looked at her with growing love, she saw the trust she was betraying with every concealed truth. You've been quiet today." Holt observed that evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Something troubling you?" "Just thinking about the past," she replied, which was true enough to avoid being an outright lie. "Sometimes memories surface when we least expect them." "Good memories or difficult ones?" "Both," she admitted. "I've been wondering what my father would think of the choices I've made." Holt studied her profile in the fading light, noting the sadness that seemed to deepen whenever she mentioned her family. "Was he a good man?" "The best," she said softly, tears threatening at the edges of her voice. "He always tried to do what was right, even when it cost him personally. I hope—" She paused, struggling with words. "I hope someday I can make him proud." "I'm sure you already have," Holt said gently. "Parents don't stop loving their children, even when circumstances separate them." His kindness made her deception feel like a physical weight pressing against her chest. This good man deserved better than a wife who lied to him daily, who brought unknown dangers to his peaceful ranch, who might disappear without explanation if her enemies discovered her location. Yet leaving would mean abandoning the first real happiness she'd known since her childhood, and possibly exposing him to retaliation from those who might suspect he knew more than he was revealing. The trap was closing around them both, and she could see no escape that wouldn't cause terrible harm to someone she was learning to love. The letter from her father remained hidden in her drawer, a tangible connection to the life she'd lost and the man who still grieved for a daughter he believed dead. Every day she delayed revealing the truth was another day she allowed his suffering to continue, another day the conspiracy succeeded in using his grief to corrupt the territory he'd sworn to serve. But it was also another day she remained alive, another day she could protect the man who'd unknowingly offered her sanctuary through an impulsive act of marriage born from loneliness and a coin flip. The confession letter arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, delivered by a dying man who collapsed at the ranch gate before anyone could question him about its origins. Jake Miller found the stranger at dawn, clutching a blood-stained envelope addressed to "the woman who calls herself Mrs. McCready," in handwriting that shook with either illness or fear. Dr. Samuel Hayes arrived from town within hours, but there was little he could do. The man had been shot in the chest and had ridden hard through the night, his life bleeding away with each mile. His final words, spoken to Josephine as she knelt beside his deathbed, were barely audible. "Marcus told me, find the governor's daughter before they silence everyone who knows." The letter itself, written in the same trembling hand, would change everything Josephine thought she understood about her kidnapping and the conspiracy that had shaped 3 years of her life. Asterisk, to Miss Josephine DeWitt, if God grants that you still live. Asterisk, asterisk. My name is Thomas Creek, and I am dying of consumption in a mining camp north of Denver. Before I meet my maker, I must confess my role in the greatest crime of my worthless life, your kidnapping and the deception that followed. Asterisk. Asterisk. I was one of the 3 men who took you from your carriage that autumn evening. We believed we were working for territorial criminals seeking ransom money, but the truth was far worse. We were tools in a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, used by men who cared nothing for our lives or yours. Asterisk. Asterisk. The man who hired us was Deputy Marshal James Crawford, but he was not acting on criminal initiative. Crawford worked for Territorial Congressman William Ashford and businessman Richard Blackwood, who needed your father distracted and weakened to advance their land consolidation scheme. Your kidnapping was never about ransom, it was about breaking Governor DeWitt's spirit and making him more malleable to their political demands. Asterisk. Asterisk. When you escaped with help from that Indian tracker, Crawford told us you had died during the attempt. He paid us to disappear and never speak of the matter again. Only recently did I learn that Crawford himself was murdered 6 months after your escape, shot down in an alley behind the territorial capital by men who wanted no loose ends remaining. Asterisk. Asterisk. My partner Billy Hawkins died in a suspicious mining accident last year. I am the last man alive who knows the truth about what really happened, and my own death approaches rapidly. Before I go, I must tell someone who might use this knowledge to expose the corruption that has poisoned our territory. Asterisk. Asterisk. The same men who arranged your kidnapping are now moving against independent miners and ranchers throughout the Silver Creek region. They are using territorial authority to justify seizures and forced sales, enriching themselves through the systematic theft of other men's honest work. Your father unknowingly advances their interests, believing he is preventing future tragedies like yours by accepting their proposals for enhanced security measures. Asterisk. Asterisk. If you live, Mr. Witt, you have the power to expose this conspiracy and restore justice to our territory. But beware, these men have killed before and will not hesitate to kill again. They have eyes and ears throughout the territorial government, and trust extends to very few. Asterisk. Asterisk. I pray this letter finds you safe and gives you the weapons needed to fight those who wronged us all. Asterisk. Asterisk. Thomas Creek, written in the shadow of death, October 1882. Asterisk. Josephine read the letter 3 times before its full implications settled into her consciousness. Everything she'd believed about her kidnapping, that it was criminal opportunism targeting her father's wealth, had been wrong. The conspiracy was larger, more systematic, and more dangerous than she'd imagined. Her father hadn't simply been grieving, he'd been manipulated. Every policy decision he'd made since her disappearance, every compromise he'd accepted in the name of territorial security, had served the interests of men who'd orchestrated her kidnapping. They'd turned his love for his daughter into a weapon against everything he'd tried to accomplish. Worse, the same forces were now targeting Holt. His silver mine and ranch represented exactly the kind of independent success that threatened their consolidation plans. Her marriage to him hadn't been a fortunate escape from her problems. It had placed him directly in the path of the conspiracy she'd been fleeing. "What's in the letter?" Holt asked gently, seeing her distress as she sat at the kitchen table with the blood-stained pages spread before her. For a moment, she considered continuing the deception that had protected them both. But the dying man's sacrifice, the revelation of her father's manipulation, and the growing certainty that her enemies were closing in made further concealment impossible. "The truth about who I really am," she said quietly, "and why we're both in terrible danger." The confession that followed was the most difficult conversation of her life. Holt listened without interruption as she revealed her identity, described her kidnapping and escape, and explained the political conspiracy that had shaped territorial policy for 3 years. When she finished, silence filled the kitchen like a physical presence. "Governor DeWitt's daughter," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "The woman who was supposedly murdered by criminals." "Yes, and you've been hiding this from me for 6 weeks. I had to. I hoped that staying hidden would keep us both safe. But this letter changes everything." Holt stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains that had represented peace and security until this moment. His silver mine, his cattle, his carefully built prosperity, all of it was now threatened by forces he'd never imagined when he'd made an impulsive proposal in a frontier saloon. "They're coming for the ranch," he said without turning around. "That's what you're telling me. These same men who kidnapped and tried to kill you are now targeting independent operations like mine." "Yes, and they're using my father's grief to provide legal justification for what amounts to systematic theft. And your father doesn't know you're alive. He thinks I'm dead. The letter says they're using his guilt and fear to manipulate his decisions. Every time he agrees to new regulations or security measures, he thinks he's preventing another tragedy like mine." Holt turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart sink. The trust that had been growing between them was gone, replaced by the careful assessment of a man who'd just learned his entire marriage was built on deception. "You should have told me," he said simply. "From the beginning, you should have trusted me with the truth." "I wanted to," she whispered. "But I was afraid they'd kill you if you knew, afraid you'd reject me if you learned what I'd brought into your life. Instead, you let me fall in love with someone who doesn't exist." The words hit her like physical blows, but she couldn't deny their accuracy. "I'm the same person I've always been. My feelings for you are real, even if my name wasn't. Are they? Or are they just part of maintaining your cover?" She had no answer for that question because she was no longer certain herself. The line between survival strategy and genuine emotion had blurred beyond recognition during their weeks together. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, and the first drops of what would become a torrential downpour began to strike the windows. The weather seemed to mirror the destruction of everything they'd built together, washing away the carefully constructed life that had given them both such unexpected happiness. The letter lay on the table between them like evidence of a crime, its revelations having shattered more than just political illusions. In exposing the conspiracy that threatened their safety, Thomas Creek's dying confession had also destroyed the trust that might have given them strength to face what was coming. Within hours, everything would change. But first, they had to decide whether they would face the approaching storm as allies united by shared danger, or as strangers bound only by a marriage certificate born from deception and a dying man's desperate attempt to expose the truth. The storm that had begun with Thomas Creek's arrival continued for 3 days, turning the mountain roads into muddy streams and giving Holt and Josephine time to prepare for what they both knew was coming. The tension between them remained thick as the storm clouds, but necessity forced them to work together despite the damaged trust. On the second day, while organizing papers in Holt's desk, Josephine discovered something that changed her understanding of the man she'd married. Hidden beneath ranch ledgers and mining reports was a small wooden box containing medals and commendations from the Civil War. The faded ribbons and tarnished bronze told a story Holt had never shared of a young soldier who'd served with distinction in some of the war's most brutal campaigns. "You never mentioned military service," she said that evening, placing the medals on the kitchen table between them. Holt glanced at the decorations with the expression of a man confronting unwelcome memories. It was a long time ago. Different life, different man. "The Battle of Antietam," she read from one citation. "Exceptional courage under fire while leading reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines." She looked up at him with new understanding. "You were a scout, among other things." His voice carried the weight of experiences he'd clearly chosen not to discuss. "War teaches skills that peaceful men hope never to use again." The revelation explained much about Holt that had puzzled her: his careful observation of terrain, the way he positioned himself to watch approaches to the ranch, his calm assessment of potential threats. The methodical rancher who'd won her through a coin flip possessed tactical knowledge that might prove invaluable in the coming confrontation. "They're not dealing with just another isolated mining operation," she said, understanding dawning. "You know how to fight." "I know how to survive," he corrected. "But knowing and wanting are different things entirely." Despite the strain between them, they began planning their defense with the systematic thoroughness that both their backgrounds had taught them. Josephine's knowledge of her enemy's methods, combined with Holt's tactical experience, created a strategy that balanced preparation with the hope that violence might still be avoided. Tom Bradley proved invaluable in these preparations. The foreman had also served in the war, though in a different regiment, and he understood immediately what the discovery of Holt's military service meant for their situation. "How many men can we count on?" Holt asked during a private conversation in the barn. "All of them, if it comes to a fight," Tom replied without hesitation. "They've heard rumors about what's been happening to other independent operations. Nobody wants to see the ranch fall to those territorial vultures." Jake Miller, initially the most suspicious of Josephine's background, became one of their strongest allies once he understood the true nature of the threat. "Makes sense now," he admitted. "Why a lady like her would be hiding in a place like this. Takes backbone to stand up against that kind of power." They prepared the ranch house with the thoroughness of soldiers expecting siege. Windows were reinforced, ammunition stockpiled, and defensive positions identified throughout the buildings and surrounding terrain. The ranch hands cleaned their weapons and organized themselves into shifts for constant surveillance. But even as they prepared for violence, Josephine wrestled with the moral complexity of her situation. Every day, her father remained ignorant of her survival. Was another day the conspiracy succeeded in using his grief to corrupt territorial governance. On the storm's final evening, she made the decision that terrified her most. "I'm going to contact my father," she announced as she and Holt reviewed their defensive preparations. "That's incredibly dangerous," he said immediately. "If the wrong people intercept the message, he deserves to know I'm alive, and he needs to understand how he's being manipulated." She met his eyes across the table. "The conspiracy only works if he remains ignorant. Once he knows the truth, their hold over him is broken. And if they kill you before the message reaches him, then at least I'll have tried to do what's right instead of what's safe." Holt studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the determined woman who'd chosen to marry a stranger rather than remain trapped in a false life. Despite his anger over her deception, he couldn't help but admire her courage. "How do you propose to contact him without alerting his enemies?" "Marshal Walsh. The telegram you showed me mentioned him investigating reports from Larkspur. If he's trustworthy enough for my father to assign him this investigation, he might be trustworthy enough to carry a private message." The letter she wrote that night was perhaps the most difficult document she'd ever composed, requiring her to convey years of separation, love, and urgent warning in terms that would convince her father of its authenticity while revealing nothing to potential interceptors. Asterisk. "Papa. Asterisk. Asterisk. I am alive and safe, though I cannot reveal my location directly. The men who took me 3 years ago were not common criminals, but agents of those who sought to manipulate your governance through personal tragedy. Thomas Creek has confessed their conspiracy from his deathbed, naming Deputy Marshal Crawford, Congressman Ashford, and businessman Blackwood as the architects of my kidnapping. Asterisk. Asterisk. They wanted you weakened and grieving, more willing to accept their proposals for territorial development. Every compromise you've made since my disappearance has served their interests, not territorial security. They are now moving against independent operations throughout Silver Creek Canyon, using your policies to provide legal cover for systematic theft. Asterisk. Asterisk. I escaped with help from Samuel Running Bear and have been hiding ever since, but recent events make concealment impossible. Trust only Marshal Walsh with this information until you can verify the loyalty of others. The conspiracy reaches into the highest levels of territorial government. Asterisk. Asterisk. Your daughter who loves you more than life itself, Josephine. Asterisk. Asterisk. P. S. Do you remember the lullaby Mama used to sing about the mountain bluebird? You hummed it the night before I left for the charity event. No one else would know that detail. Asterisk. The final lines were insurance against forgery, a private memory that would convince her father of the letter's authenticity while meaning nothing to anyone else. Getting the letter to Marshal Walsh required careful planning. Tom Bradley volunteered to ride to Larkspur under cover of purchasing supplies, carrying the message hidden in his saddlebags. The risk was enormous. If the wrong people discovered the correspondence, both Tom and Josephine would likely pay with their lives. As Tom departed in the pre-dawn darkness, Josephine felt the weight of consequences settling around her. Within hours, the message would either reach her father or fall into the hands of those who'd tried to kill her once before. Either way, her years of hiding were over. "No going back now," Holt observed, watching the foreman disappear into the mountain mist. "No," she agreed. "For better or worse, the truth is finally in motion." They stood together on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose, both aware that this might be their last peaceful morning. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp with the scent of snow and pine. It would have been a perfect day for simple ranch life, for the quiet contentment they'd briefly found together. Instead, it was the day that would determine whether their impulsive marriage had been a stroke of fortune or a fatal mistake, whether love born from deception could survive the test of absolute truth, and whether two people who'd found unexpected happiness together could protect it against forces that had already destroyed so much. In the distance, a hawk circled over the valley, riding thermals that carried it high above the concerns of earthbound creatures. Josephine envied its freedom, its ability to simply soar away from approaching danger. But she was no longer running, no longer hiding behind false names and carefully constructed lies. Whatever came next, she would face it as Governor DeWitt's daughter, as Holt McCready's wife, and as a woman who'd finally chosen truth over safety, regardless of the cost. The attack came at dawn on the fourth day, just as the morning mist began to lift from the valley floor. Jake Miller's shout from the lookout position shattered the quiet. Riders coming, at least 12 men, armed and moving fast. Holt grabbed the signal mirror from his desk, a piece of military equipment he'd kept from his war years, and flashed 3 quick bursts of reflected sunlight toward the eastern ridge, where Tom Bradley waited with reinforcements from town. The pre-arranged signal would bring help, but not quickly enough to prevent the initial assault. "Positions," Holt called to the ranch hands, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command under fire. Years of peaceful ranch management fell away as tactical instincts reasserted themselves. "Remember, we're defending, not attacking. Make every shot count and keep them from reaching the house." Josephine checked the small derringer hidden in her skirts, then picked up the Winchester rifle Holt had taught her to use during their defensive preparations. Her hands were steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. After 3 years of running and hiding, she was finally ready to stand and fight. The riders approached in a loose formation that spoke of professional experience rather than random violence. These weren't ordinary claim jumpers or territorial desperados. They moved with the disciplined coordination of men accustomed to military action. At their head rode a figure Josephine recognized from her father's political gatherings. Deputy Marshal James Crawford, supposedly dead for over a year according to Thomas Creek's letter, but very much alive and leading the assault on their ranch. "Crawford," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. The confession letter was wrong about his death. He's still alive and still working for them. "The deputy marshal?" Holt asked, raising his rifle to sight on the approaching riders. "The man who arranged my kidnapping. If he's here personally, they're desperate to silence me before my father learns the truth." The first shots came from the attackers as they spread out to surround the ranch buildings. Bullets splintered wood near the windows where Holt and his men had taken defensive positions. The sound of gunfire echoed off the mountain walls, sharp and deadly in the morning air. Jake Miller's rifle cracked from the barn, and one of the attackers tumbled from his horse. The old cowboy's accuracy hadn't diminished with age, and his strategic position gave him clear lines of sight to multiple approaches. "Keep them away from the house," Holt shouted, working the lever of his Winchester as he tracked targets through the window. His military training was evident in the calm precision of his movements, each shot carefully aimed and economically delivered. Josephine fired at a rider attempting to flank their position, her bullet striking his horse and sending both animal and rider sprawling into the dirt. She'd never shot at human beings before, but the knowledge that these men had destroyed her family's peace and threatened everything she'd come to love made the moral choice clear. Crawford's voice carried across the gunfire as he directed his men with tactical expertise. "Suppressing fire on the main house. Johnson, take 3 men around the back. We need the woman alive, if possible." The qualification in his orders sent chills through Josephine. They wanted her alive to discover what she knew and whom she might have told, but their willingness to kill everyone else was evident in the intensity of their attack. The ranch hands fought with the desperate courage of men defending their home and livelihood. Each of them understood that defeat meant more than just personal death. It meant the destruction of everything Holt had built and the triumph of the corruption that was poisoning territorial governance. A bullet shattered the window near Josephine's position, sending glass fragments across the floor. She moved to a different window, maintaining her field of fire while avoiding the concentrated attention her previous position had attracted. From his position in the barn, Jake Miller's voice carried a warning. "They're trying to flank us. 3 riders heading for the back of the house." Holt immediately repositioned 2 of his men to cover the rear approaches while maintaining defensive fire toward the front. The coordination required delicate timing and absolute trust between men who'd worked together for years but never faced life-and-death combat. The signal mirror caught sunlight again as Holt flashed desperate messages toward the eastern ridge. Tom Bradley and the reinforcements from town were their only hope of surviving this assault, but each minute of delay cost precious ammunition and brought Crawford's men closer to overwhelming their defenses. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Josephine heard something that made her heart race with hope, the distant sound of answering rifle fire from the eastern approach. Tom had received their signals and was engaging Crawford's men from behind, catching them between 2 forces just as Holt had planned. "They're taking fire from the ridge," one of Crawford's men shouted. "We've got hostiles behind us." The tide of battle was beginning to shift, but the outcome remained desperately uncertain as gunfire intensified from multiple directions and the mountain morning echoed with the sounds of a conflict that would determine the future of more than just one isolated ranch. The sound of approaching horses from the south brought a new dimension to the battle as Governor Theodore DeWitt himself rode into the valley with Marshal Walsh and 6 territorial marshals. The governor had received Josephine's letter just hours after Tom Bradley delivered it, and his response had been immediate and decisive. "Father," Josephine cried from the window, seeing the familiar figure directing his men with the same authoritative bearing she remembered from her childhood. 3 years of separation vanished in an instant as she recognized the man who'd shaped her understanding of justice and duty. Governor DeWitt's appearance on the battlefield transformed the tactical situation completely. Crawford's men found themselves surrounded, caught between the ranch's defenders, Tom Bradley's reinforcements, and the territorial marshals who represented legitimate law enforcement. "Cease firing!" DeWitt's voice carried across the valley with commanding authority. "This is Governor DeWitt with territorial marshals. You are ordered to lay down your weapons." But Crawford, recognizing that capture meant exposure of the entire conspiracy, chose desperate action over surrender. "Keep fighting," he shouted to his remaining men. "We're all dead if they take us alive." The family photograph that Josephine had kept hidden in her belongings seemed to burn against her consciousness as she watched her father dismount and take position with his marshals. The faded image of happier times, father and daughter together in the mansion garden, contrasted sharply with this reunion amid gunfire and violence. Marshal Walsh proved his loyalty by directing his men with precision that spoke of careful planning and absolute trust in the governor's judgment. The marshals moved with professional efficiency, their presence adding legitimate authority to what might otherwise have been dismissed as a private dispute between ranchers and claim jumpers. "Josephine," Governor DeWitt called during a brief lull in the gunfire. "Are you safe?" "Yes, Papa," she replied, her voice breaking with emotion at hearing her father speak her name after 3 years of believing her dead. "I'm here. I'm alive." Crawford's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully constructed manipulation was crumbling. The governor's reunion with his living daughter would expose years of political deception and criminal conspiracy. His only hope now lay in preventing that exposure through violence. "Take the woman," Crawford ordered his remaining men, whatever the cost. But Holt Macready stepped into view, his rifle trained steadily on the corrupt deputy marshal. The methodical rancher had been replaced by the combat veteran, moving with the deadly competence that had earned him military decorations in a war that felt like another lifetime. "You'll have to go through me first," Holt said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. The final confrontation between Crawford and the ranch defenders was brief but decisive. Caught between multiple forces and facing determined resistance from men fighting for their homes and principles, the corrupt marshal's remaining allies began to surrender despite his increasingly frantic orders to continue fighting. Jake Miller's rifle spoke one final time, sending Crawford's weapon spinning from his hands as the deputy marshal attempted to target Josephine through a window. The old cowboy's accuracy remained undiminished, even under combat stress. "It's over, Crawford," Marshal Walsh called out. "Surrender now, and you might live to stand trial." But Crawford, understanding that his capture would implicate powerful men who wouldn't hesitate to silence him permanently, chose one last desperate gambit. Drawing a concealed pistol, he aimed not at the marshals or ranch hands, but directly at Governor DeWitt. "If I can't have the daughter's silence, I'll have the father's death," he snarled. Time seemed to slow as multiple weapons swung toward Crawford, but Josephine was closest and fastest. Her derringer appeared in her hand as she stepped through the doorway, placing herself between the corrupt marshal and her father. The two shots came almost simultaneously, Crawford's pistol and Josephine's derringer firing within a heartbeat of each other. But years of hiding and survival had honed her reflexes to deadly precision, while Crawford's desperation made his aim unsteady. Crawford fell backward, clutching his chest, while Josephine remained standing, though visibly shaken by the violence she'd been forced to commit. The conspiracy that had shaped 3 years of territorial politics and personal tragedy was ending in gunsmoke and justice finally served. "Papa," Josephine whispered, as Governor DeWitt reached her, his arms enfolding the daughter he'd mourned for so long. The photograph in her belongings had captured them in peaceful times, but this reunion amid violence and vindication carried deeper meaning about survival, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of family love. Around them, the surviving conspirators were being taken into custody by Marshal Walsh's men, while the ranch hands began assessing damage and casualties. The immediate threat was over, but the larger work of exposing the conspiracy and restoring honest governance to the territory was just beginning. Holt watched the reunion between father and daughter with mixed emotions, relief at their survival, satisfaction at justice served, but uncertainty about what this revelation would mean for the marriage they'd built on deception and an impulsive coin flip in a frontier saloon. 6 months later, the Silver Creek Ranch had become a symbol of honest prosperity restored, its reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the dramatic events that had exposed territorial corruption. The spring sun warmed the mountain meadows, where cattle grazed peacefully, and the mining operation continued to produce silver under legitimate territorial oversight rather than corrupt manipulation. Holt stood in the ranch house parlor, adjusting the collar of his best suit as he prepared for a ceremony he'd never expected to experience twice with the same woman. In his hands, he held a pair of new wedding rings properly chosen this time, not hastily purchased in response to a drunken dare, but selected with care to symbolize the genuine commitment that had grown from their unlikely beginning. Through the window, he could see guests arriving for what the territorial newspapers had dubbed the wedding that saved Colorado. Governor DeWitt had insisted on a proper ceremony to celebrate his daughter's marriage, one that acknowledged both the unusual circumstances of their first union and the authentic love that had developed despite its deceptive origins. "Nervous?" Tom Bradley asked, entering the parlor in his own carefully pressed Sunday clothes. The foreman had become something of a territorial hero himself, his role in exposing the conspiracy earning him recognition throughout the region. "Different kind of nervous than the first time," Holt replied honestly. Then it was uncertainty about what I was getting myself into. Now it's wanting to do right by what we've built together. The political aftermath of Crawford's defeat had been swift and thorough. Congressman Ashford and businessman Blackwood had been arrested within days, their network of corruption unraveling as investigators followed the evidence Thomas Creek's confession had provided. Governor DeWitt's reputation had been restored, his previous policy compromises now understood as the actions of a grieving father manipulated by his daughter's supposed murderers. Josephine appeared in the parlor doorway, and Holt's breath caught at the sight of her in her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit perfectly. She was no longer the mysterious woman in emerald green who'd caught his eye across a saloon, nor the frightened fugitive who'd hidden her identity from everyone, including the man she'd married. She was simply herself, intelligent, brave, and beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with circumstances or deception. "Ready for our first wedding?" she asked with a smile that held all the warmth that had been missing from their original ceremony. "More than ready," he replied, offering her his arm. The ceremony took place on the ranch's front lawn, with guests ranging from territorial dignitaries to local ranchers and mining families. Governor DeWitt performed the honors himself, having been ordained specifically for the occasion, a gesture that spoke to both his joy at his daughter's happiness and his desire to personally sanctify the union that had saved them all. "We gather today not just to witness a marriage," the governor began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of public speaking but softened by paternal affection, "but to celebrate the mysterious ways that Providence can work through human choices, even impulsive ones made in frontier saloons." Gentle laughter rippled through the assembled guests, many of whom had heard various versions of the story by now. The tale of the wealthy rancher who'd chosen his bride on a coin flip only to discover he'd married the territorial governor's supposedly dead daughter had become legend throughout Colorado. As they exchanged the new rings, Holt and Josephine spoke, vows they'd written themselves, words that acknowledged their unusual beginning while promising a future built on honesty and mutual respect. The simple gold bands represented not just their commitment to each other, but the transformation of an impulsive arrangement into a marriage based on genuine love and shared values. "I promise to trust you with the truth always," Josephine said as she placed the ring on Holt's finger, "and to never again hide behind deception, no matter how well-intentioned." "I promise to see you for who you truly are," Holt replied, "not who circumstances might require you to be, and to stand with you whatever challenges we may face." After the ceremony, as guests celebrated with music and dancing, Josephine found herself on the porch with her father, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar shades of gold and rose. The territorial capital seemed like another world compared to the peaceful ranch that had become her true home. "Are you happy?" Governor DeWitt asked quietly, studying his daughter's face for signs of the contentment that had been missing during her years in hiding. "Happier than I ever thought possible after everything that happened," she replied honestly. "Holt is a good man, Papa, the kind of man you taught me to recognize and respect. And the ranch life? It's quite different from what you were raised to expect." Josephine looked out over the valley where cattle grazed and silver mines operated under honest management, where the work was hard but the rewards were earned through legitimate effort. "It's better than what I was raised to expect," she said. "It's real in ways I never understood before." As the evening deepened and guests began to depart, Holt joined them on the porch. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, each reflecting on the remarkable series of events that had brought them to this moment of peace and security. The conspiracy had been thoroughly exposed and its perpetrators brought to justice. Territorial governance had been restored to honest principles. Independent operators throughout the region were once again free to pursue their ambitions without fear of corrupt interference. Most importantly, a marriage that had begun with deception and desperation had been transformed into a partnership based on truth, trust, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure rather than breaking apart. Sometimes a single moment can change everything you thought you knew about your life. For Holt and Josephine Macready, that moment had come in a frontier saloon on a night when loneliness and a coin flip had seemed to offer the only escape from lives that felt incomplete. They discovered that Providence sometimes works through the most unlikely circumstances, turning impulsive choices into lasting blessings and transforming two separate stories of isolation into one shared tale of love, justice, and the courage to fight for what matters most.